Good evening, everyone. First of all, let me begin by thanking all of you for gathering here with us this evening at the beautiful Kislak Center for what I believe is a timely and urgently needed dialogue on climate change and its impacts in the Caribbean region. Secondly, I would like to thank the Humanities Center for inviting Professor Mimi Scheller to join us here at the University of Miami to present the Henry King Stanford Distinguished Professor's Lecture. Mimi and I were just recalling that it was about 15 years ago that she was here to launch her book, Consuming the Caribbean. And it was a particularly exciting moment for me, for my students, and 15 years later I can say, as my book is scheduled to be published next year, that Mimi's work has really influenced in a large and significant way the way I came to think about practices of consumption in the Caribbean region. My work focuses more on popular culture. Mimi's work is broad. It includes environmental, cultural, social, political, and most importantly, mobility studies. I'm glad that she's here with us today to share some of her research from her most recent book, which is forthcoming with Duke University Press, entitled Island Futures: Caribbean Survival in the Anthropocene. Mimi Scheller, as you know, is a professor of sociology and the director of the Center for Mobilities Research and Policy at Drexel University. I remember many years ago, almost 20 years ago, in several of our email conversations, I'm thinking to myself, mobility studies, what an interesting concept. But I'd not really heard of it. I was just graduating with my PhD. And I started to look around the US to see what kind of research. At the time, Mimi was at Lancaster University. And while there were sociologists in the US doing this kind of research, there was not a center dedicated to mobility studies, which I thought deeply ironic in the United States of America, right? Where a land of immigrants, a land of migrants, and yet not much research explicitly looking at the pathways and circumstances that brought many of these immigrant communities together. But Mimi's move to the US around 2006 marked a notable shift in the number of symposiums and conferences on mobility studies. Her voice has been a critical bellwether about the impacts of structural adjustment, runaway globalization, and the increasingly inequitable structure of the tourism industry in the Caribbean region for well over 2 decades. However, to say that Mimi Scheller is one of the leading thinkers in the area of mobility studies would be actually to minimize the breadth of her tireless work as a social scientist, a historian, a cultural critic, and an environmentalist. For me, what makes Mimi's scholarship, teaching, and activism distinct is her singularity of purpose in analyzing a range of geopolitical and ecological crises, all of them with long and complex colonial histories in the Caribbean region. In Consuming the Caribbean, she poses an important question, one that I believe still undergirds much of her work over the last 20 years. She asks, and I quote, "How do forms of mobility, stabilization, and consumption combine to locate the Caribbean as a place apart from the West? The ties that bind the Caribbean to other places, I argue, are premised on everyday practices of consumption that occur through economies of movement, touch, and taste in overlapping fields of economic consumption, political consumption, and cultural consumption. In recognizing such circuits of consumption, it becomes evident how various mobilities are crucial not only to the formation of world systems of trade and production, but also to the constitution of world systems of consumption," end quote. If we fast forward about 16 years, 6 monographs, 8 edited collections, and over 50 peer-reviewed articles and numerous book chapters, what we will find is an unrelenting critical inquiry that continues to ask difficult questions about the cost of comfort and leisure for the few, without consideration for the lasting impacts of tourism, oil drilling and refining, bauxite mining, and other extractive economies in the Caribbean region. We can certainly map this critical trajectory across several of her monographs, beginning with Consuming the Caribbean, through Aluminum Dreams, The Making of Light Modernity, and certainly Mobility Justice, the Politics of Movement in an Age of Extremes. Her work has helped shape critical debates in globalization and modernity, Caribbean identity and nationalism, global warming, environmental justice, and island nation states across the Caribbean region. Her recent work continues that line of inquiry taken in some of her previous projects, however, with a singular focus on Haiti, and I think this is the work she will share with us today. I read a few reviews of Mimi's work in the interest of preparing for this introduction, and in one reviewer, Scott Golden, asserts, and I quote here, that Scheller writes from a place of radicalism, where she makes evident that no injustice today is a blank page. It is not standalone or original. This appears to be what Scheller wants us to revisit when considering how to dismantle injustice. Not a reverse engineering of modern issues, but rebuilding from a new consciousness. It is necessary to understand that the book, and here he's referring to Mobility Justice, is making the case for how to go about reinventing society, not a single appendage. Mobility is synonymous with power, and power is systemic and institutionalized. Creating true justice in any one realm, be it climate, housing, education, requires the decentralization of power. And Scheller is extensively cataloging the missteps. He concludes by suggesting that the best way to engage with this text is to consider it, quote, as an effort to dig further into the sordid vines of history and to try to assess which roots to cut first, end quote. Now, I suppose there are worse things for that people could say about you, but I think that given the content of Scheller's critical analysis, that writing from a place of radicalism has, for Scheller, been accompanied by action from a similar location. And however, it's been guided by the aims and purposes of the people in the communities where she seeks most to assist. One of the things that makes all of Scheller's work invaluable to me is her effort to find ways to make her scholarly work accountable and applicable in real-time practices on the ground, in rebuilding efforts in Haiti, in refugee camps, working with artists like Ai Weiwei, to better implement communication power stations, because for refugees fleeing war, famine, or other natural and man-made disasters, their smartphones are literally their lifelines. These efforts include several NSF rapid grants that focus on everything from supporting Haitian infrastructure, reconstruction decisions with local knowledge, as well as understanding hydroclimatic changes and exploring sustainable solutions in the Southwest closed water basin in Southwest Hispaniola. In this regard, then, I would say that the reviewer's critique of Mobility Justice falls slightly short in one critical aspect of what it means to think and do work in and about the Caribbean region. The poets Derek Walcott and Norbesi Phillip both remind us that the sea is history. It carries in it the genetic memory of the Middle Passage, of colonialism, of indentureship, and so does the land that is surrounded by the sea. Warming oceans, longer droughts, deforestation, and widespread pollution of the air, the earth, and the water affects us all. But as we all know too well, in Haiti, Barbuda, Dominica, Puerto Rico, the Abaco Islands, the Mud, and Marsh Island, cutting the root will do little to address the reality that small nation states contribute less than 1% of greenhouse emissions, but so far they have borne out the most devastating effects of climate change. This work is undoubtedly arduous, and it requires creative and, in some instances, obvious solutions, but our survival depends on it. These are some of the issues that Mimi Scheller has dedicated her time, her energy, and indeed her career to addressing, and I would like to invite her to the podium to continue this conversation with us this evening.
Greetings, everyone. I'm going to start with a little drink. So that was quite an introduction. Thank you so much, Pat. And I want to thank Hugh Thomas, the director of the Center for the Humanities, and for the Center for inviting me here as one of this year's Henry King Stanford Distinguished Professors. It's really humbling to follow in the footsteps of people like Hazel Carby, Catherine Hall, Vincent Brown, and so many others who've come here before me, and to join my friend Sarah Ahmed, who will be here later this year. I also want to acknowledge, before I begin, that we are on the traditional lands of the Tequesta people. And I didn't know too much about this people who do not exist anymore, but I understand that was the Biscayne Bay area indigenous population. And I'm also, in my talk, going to be concerned with the lands of the Taino people. Although it's widely taught that that group faced genocide in the wake of European colonization, in fact, it's recently been shown that their DNA, their genome, lives on in the people of Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, probably Haiti, and beyond. So I want to acknowledge their ancestral homes, their current inhabitants, and their future generations. So my talk is called Caribbean Futures and the Coloniality of Climate Change. And although it arises out of the book I've been working on, which was called Island Futures, Caribbean Survival in the Anthropocene, the talk itself does not come directly from the book because events keep so rapidly kind of generating new emergencies, new catastrophes, new situations that we want to deal with. And so I wanted to make this as relevant to people now as I could. So I'm actually not going to be reflecting back on the research projects that I did in Haiti, but I'll be sort of pushing forward to some new concerns, and in particular concerns about Caribbean futures. Today I visited the Perez Art Museum to see this exhibition in which this painting appears by LeVar Monroe. The painting is called Rehearsal for Reconstruction, 2019, from the exhibition that's called The Other Side of Now, Foresight in Contemporary Caribbean Art. It's curated by Maria Elena Ortiz and Marcia Pierce. Since my topic today is Caribbean Futures, I found the exhibition very helpful to help frame what I'm going to speak about tonight. And I wonder how many people here have actually seen the exhibition already. So I encourage you, go to Pam and see it if you can. So on the one hand, the show aspires to break away from the weight of the past on Caribbean art and culture generally, that has for so long had to address colonial legacies, traumas, and catastrophe after catastrophe. The curators posed the question to each artist to think instead about what is the Caribbean future, hoping to sort of break the chains of